I'm Zim, and you're listening to the Helpful Photographer Podcast in collaboration with New York City Photo Safari. To register for a safari, please visit newyorkcityphotosafari.com. In the previous podcast, I talked about how metering works, but as you heard me say, unless you have an incident handheld meter, you may find that the exposure your camera is rendering is not what you expected. So now I'm going to tell you how to overcome this problem. First, I want to say that although the exposure may not be what you expected, it does not mean that the camera was wrong. It just means that it may not have been what you wanted or perhaps expected. What you need to understand is that all metering systems are always trying to get to the middle exposure. Unfortunately, sometimes the exposure may render the image too dark or too bright for your taste. This problem is almost exclusively relegated to reflective meters like the ones we have in our cameras. As I explained in the previous podcast, reflective meters measure everything from the darkest to the brightest areas of the scene and then takes an average of the two. If your image is skewed disproportionately either to the dark or the bright areas, then this will skew your average, making your picture either too dark or too bright. There are several ways to overcome this problem. One is to manually override the exposure by moving your f-stop, your shutter speed, or your ISO. You can also move your exposure compensation up or down if you're not shooting in a manual mode. The last way to overcome this problem is to meter the scene differently. The key method many websites recommend is through spot metering. But spot metering works exactly the same as wide area metering. The only difference is that it's taking a reading from a very small area of the frame. What you would do is take a spot meter reading from something that is middle gray. What you're doing is you're telling the camera what the middle value of your scene is. This is why a neutral density gray card is so handy. You would put that gray card in the middle of your image area and ask the camera to take a reading off of that and then remove it just before firing your final shot. But this isn't the most convenient way of taking a reading, especially if you're shooting something on the other side of the Grand Canyon, just as I mentioned in the previous podcast about the incident meter. If you don't have a gray card handy, you could simply choose a spot in the scene that is close to middle gray. The fundamental problem with this method is, unless you know what middle gray looks like, your exposure will still be skewed. The other disadvantage is that you will have to continue to take readings off of that area every time you push the button. This is why I like to use a wide area metering system and then just exposure compensate when necessary. On the other hand, many people will tell you to use center weighted metering. Unfortunately, you're going to face the same issues. The only difference being that center-weighted metering looks at a much larger area of the frame than spot metering, and a much smaller area than wide area metering. Remember, all three of these metering systems work the same. They take a reading and bring us to middle gray. The only difference is the size of the target area that it's reading from. With spot metering, you can reduce that area to just 4% of the frame, while center-weighted can be 60 to 80%, while wide area can be 80 to 100%. Now, for those who freak out about histograms that pull to the left or the right, I say, meh. As always, my question is, what do you think of the photo? Do you like it? Does the over or under exposure actually enhance the image? If so, why would you bother changing it? Unless that exposure renders an image you do not like, I wouldn't change a thing. In the next podcast, I'll talk about what to do if your images are consistently over or underexposed. And it ain't gonna be what you think. I hope that was helpful. Until next time, keep on shooting.